Thank you everyone for attending the Accelerating Efficiency Together webinar series. I'm Danielle Starr. I'm GrowSafe's Global Marketing Communications Manager. And with us today, we have Mark Nelson. He's the Director of Industry Relations for GrowSafe. And we also have with us Dr. Tommy Perkins from West Texas A&M. Together, they're going to be discussing the return on investment for selecting feed efficiency. Just as you have been doing, please continue to register for each webinar, and you'll be able to watch the webinars just as you are right now live. And then also after the webinars, you'll be receiving an email with a link to the on-demand session. Each webinar is going to be approximately 20 minutes in length with about 10 minutes at the end for questions. Just as we have been doing, we'll try to get to everyone's questions. Those that we're not able to get to, we'll be sure to answer after the webinar. And also, if you think of questions after the webinar is completed, always feel free to email those in to info@growsafe.com. Throughout the webinar, we're going to have a couple of polling questions. We invite you to engage in those questions, as we'll be sharing those results live with you as we go. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and we're going to get started.
Thank you, Danielle. Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in. We have quite a few folks that are logged on internationally, so welcome to everyone. So today we're going to talk about the return on investment for selection for feed efficiency. So if you've been to a GrowSafe meeting or you've looked online or researched the value of efficiency, you've seen all these numbers before. With selection for RFI, you can reduce feed intake at 12%, maintenance 10%, feed conversion 15%. You've seen all these numbers, and it's pretty clear that when you start looking at these things, that feed efficiency will make you money. But today we're going to look into a little bit closer as far as how you can use a GrowSafe system and have GrowSafe as your partner to get you there. Before we do that, I did want to quantify a little bit what we're talking about today on return on investment. There's a lot of different ways to look at this. So in particular, in utilizing a GrowSafe system, I guess the answer is how you quantify it depends a lot upon how you use your system, and you have options of how you use it. It also depends a lot upon when or how you measure your return on investment. We've got producers that test for 35 days DMI. They test longer for RFI, which doesn't take a lot longer with the GrowSafe beef. So that would depend on your put through as far as what you can look at for return on investment. We've got people that put in systems that use it for research and teaching tools. That's a whole different kind of return on investment, of course. You can test your animals in somebody else's system and just pay a fee to have them tested. You can also use it where you put in your own system and you run it as a custom system. And then when you start looking at your return on investment, if you look at return after 1 year, it's a little bit tough because you've got the cost of a system. But if you start looking at what your returns are over the 5-year term of a typical agreement, it starts changing things. And even beyond what we're going to talk about today, if you really look at the return on investment over, say, 10 years, where you've given your genetics a real chance to propagate in your herd, that's pretty significant also. You can look at your return on investment within the cow herd, through the feed yard, through marketing bulls. We're going to touch on most of those things today. So the agenda, first of all, I'll visit with you about what it looks like if you were to put in a system and custom test for others. And then also what it looked like if you put in a system and you tested and marketed your own bulls. Then Dr. Tommy Perkins will visit with you about what it looks like for your return on progeny through the feed yard, and also all the way through the cow herd. We'll follow up with questions. So just to clarify one quick thing also, when you select for feed efficiency, you can use GrowSafe's technology to improve its test for both gain and efficiency. Means we do just have a 20-minute webinar today. We're going to really key in on the improved feed efficiency. But we always contend that you should select for both at the same time. You can use GrowSafe to do that. But being feed is 70% of all production costs, that's what we're going to key in on today. So if you put in a GrowSafe system and you operate it as a custom test system, looking for a profit opportunity. We're going to talk about the math behind this based around if you put in just the minimum size beef genetic program you can through GrowSafe, and that would include 8 feed intake nodes and a 4-position GrowSafe beef. The costs we assign to this, which we're not going to talk about specific costs today because it varies so much internationally with shipping and install, different currencies. So just behind the scenes, we just ran the math on kind of a US return on investment. If you operated this system after putting it in with the shipping and install costs, the cost of technology, and any of the analytics and warranty fees you have spread out over 5 years, we've plugged in what we would call typical custom test fees. Once again, I'm not going to get into exactly what those fees might be because every one of our clients has their own system and they set their fees, and it once again varies significantly from country to country and currency to currency. So for the put through on this kind of a system, it's standard costs and standard fees. We just assumed that you would operate 5 turns out of a potential 6. And if you run it year round, you can easily get 6 in. But we think 5 is probably more average over industry the way we see our clients use it. We also assumed a pen capacity at 90%. There's never a perfect day, so that not every pen is full every time. But this does equate to over 1 year, you could test 288 bulls. If you're testing heifers, you could test a few more because you can test a few more heifers per node. But we assume 288 bulls for this example. So for the return on investment, we use the discount rate of 4.5%. For this example would be the minimum rate of return one is willing to accept. And we use 4.5% just as this is kind of the interest rate that should be pretty easy to get at current times at a bank. So when you look at that, if you were to put in a system and operate it this way, you've got a really nice gross return on investment of 104%. with an internal rate of return at 29.7%. When you look at this, it pays for itself at about the beginning of year 3. So Danielle, I think that brings us up to our first polling question. So are you currently using proven efficiency genetics with several choices? Yes, a progeny of efficient cows, or progeny of efficient sires, or progeny of both, or no, you're not selecting for efficient genetics yet.
All right, we're gonna let a few more seconds of voting come in. And we're gonna end the poll.
Okay, so looks like the big opportunity as we look at this is to have progeny of efficient cows. We always do say that one of the most important things you can do is to test your replacement females because you get the benefit of them for their lifetime. Looks like 26%. Oh, Danielle, it went away there. Thank you. 26% of you have progeny of efficient sires. 14% are doubling up on both. That's great. And 60% are not yet. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and hopefully you enjoy some potential return on investment we talk about, and next year that number will be a little bit differently. Thank you, Danielle. So the next topic I'm going to talk about is if you're putting in a GrowSafe system and you're testing and marketing your own bulls. And we're going to look at the value in a seed stock operation in efficiency savings. So in this example, the way we chose to quantify it is if you've started testing and you selected through your own herd, identifying and utilizing a -0.5 RFI EPD sire, as compared to if you just rolled the dice and had an average bull, or even actually intentionally selected an average bull with a 0 EPD. For this example, we looked at strictly the in-herd feed cost savings of progeny developed through bull sale or about a year of age for males and females. And to quantify it further, we looked at if you selected this bull and used him, we would assume that you're going to use him for probably 4 breeding seasons. You're probably going to do a little bit of AI around him, so he's probably going to have about 50 calves per year out of him. Over 4 years, that equals 200 total progeny. So in quantifying the feed cost savings on those progeny, we looked at the time basically between weaning and yearling, which is about 200 days of age, and feed cost savings. We didn't look at anything beyond that. Tommy's going to cover some of those things as far as through the cow herd and potential things for the feed yard, but we looked at just the development phase, a window in time on progeny, when you'd probably still own those progeny as a seed stock producer. Using that minus 0.5 RFI EPD, we quantify that each progeny would be expected to consume a ½ pound less per day. We put in the ration cost of US $260 per ton, or 13 cents per pound. So the savings you would expect from that one bull after you put in a GrowSafe system and found him is the progeny feed cost savings would be $2,790 on that sire, as compared to a sire that, sorry about that, a sire that was a 0 EPD. And when you compare that, if you selected for against a plus 0.5 RFI EPD, you can obviously double that. So you've got $5,580 just in progeny saving through the development phase. And we did also include in there the what you'd save on feeding that bull over his lifetime as well. So when you start looking at the impact it has on just the development costs of progeny within your own test system, it's pretty significant. And these dollar amounts happen every day in the industry. It's a pretty conservative estimate as well when you start looking at the benefit, like so many of our producers online, where you have it on both the sire and the dam. You can expect a bigger impact and return on investment. And even more significantly, the people that are stacking generations, this number just multiplies it as well. So we're not looking at this example too. I want to note that we're not looking at any increased sale price you might get from marketing efficient bulls, which we would sure hope you could expect to market your bulls better as you gained a reputation as a seed stock producer marketing efficient genetics. We didn't plug that in here because that's kind of up to everybody to market their own genetics effectively. Like I said, Tommy will get into here in just a minute some additional value that you get through the cow herd on feed cost savings, and then any progeny of steers that go through the feed yard. So with that, I will turn that over to Dr. Tommy Perkins. He's the cow-calf chair and associate professor at West Texas A&M University. So Tommy, and you just tell me when you want me to flip slides, and I'll drive it from here.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Danielle. I appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Welcome to my office in Canyon, Texas. We're battling, trying to stay safe, COVID. So I've got my mask on. Lucky I don't have to wear it today. So we'll hopefully get through this. Next slide, please. There's a lot of ways to look at return on investment. Mark talked about some of those. And if I look at it, it's a ratio of the outputs versus the inputs. And I always tell my students is how much additional income did you get versus how much did it actually cost you to get that additional income. If I just throw an example up there and we look at what Mark just talked about in developing these bulls. So I developed my bulls. Now I'm going to receive a $1,000 premium for each one of those bulls that I actually RFI tested. Now, if it cost me $800 to get that additional $1,000 sale price on those bulls, and if I did my math right, that's about a 25% return on investment. I think everybody will line up for that kind of investment. And having ran, been executive director of 2 breed associations, it was always fun to me when I talked to some of those breeders that had fewer numbers of bulls that'd be tested, and they'd always tell me they could actually test them cheaper at their house. And then I always challenge them with the fact that what is that bull going to tear up, all the things that he's going to go through that you're going to have to pay for this on top of the feed costs that you're going to be getting. So I really like these centralized GrowSafe tests that are being produced out there, and compliments to every one of those commercial guys that they're actually providing this service to us as seed stock producers. We sure appreciate that. And we can sure show you can get a return on investment by doing that. Next slide, please. Now, I always use this one in class. If you go back and you look at some of the Australian data, and there's a lot of this data out there, even in the United States now and in Europe, where it shows that we get about a 0.2 to 0.4 heritability range. And if you've taken an animal breeding class, they'll always tell you that's moderately to highly heritable. And John Janot talked about, I think 2 weeks ago, where he had talked about the development of EPDs, and that level of heritability is significant. We can make changes, we can move the needle, we can save costs because we know we can select for it. So I put a formula up there. I know you didn't come here for a math lesson today, but if we look at genetic change, and I always tell my students is they have to work this problem in class, that's delta G. Delta G or genetic change is selection differential. It's what the SD is, and some call it selection intensity. All that is the value of the animals that you select to keep related to the average of the population. You're going to multiply that times the heritability and divide that by generation interval. Generation interval is basically, the definition-wise, is the average age of the progeny when average age of the parent when their progeny reproduce. So in cattle, that's kind of a long time frame. So I'll give you an example here. Let's assume that I take a -3 RFI bull, and population average was actually a +3. That means we're going to select for, and that should be a -6 there. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving or not, but that's a -6 difference in the two, the selected versus the population was selected from, times the 0.3 heritability. And I just used a 0.3 kind of an average there. And we're going to divide that by an average generation for the beef industry, which is 5 years. And that'll give you a -1.8. Mark, if you can point that 1.8, that's a negative. That should be -1.8. Divided by 5 years gives you a -0.36 units of improvement RFI, based in selection of one calf crop of RFI feed efficient tested bulls. So again, that's pretty significant when we look at is their value here. Next slide, please. This is some data that Dr. Monty Curley, and he probably shared this 2 weeks ago. When we look at the project that they did, they looked at 5 bulls, and then these could have been 5 RFI tested bulls or not. But what they did is they took 10 progeny minimal, and there may have been a few more in each one of these particular sires, A through E, and they looked at the advantage that each one of those progeny from those 5 sires had. And it's pretty cool to look at that when you compare bull C to bull E. Pretty simple. That's $80 difference. That's an $80 advantage per calf by using an RFI. Again, the RFIs in this particular table are the RFIs of the calves that were tested. And that $80 advantage is, again, what kind of return on investment is that? I think most of you line up for that one. Additionally, you can look at, there's about 27% improvement in feed cost alone based on that intake. 1,732 pounds versus 24.4 pounds. Again, bull C versus bull E. Pretty neat work Dr. Curley's been doing. Next slide, please. This is probably a good place for a polling question number 2, if you don't mind, Danielle. On average, what is your annual cost for feed, pasture, and hay per cow? And your choices are $400, $550, $700, and $850. I think Danielle said I was supposed to talk through this and not let it get quiet, right, Mark?
I did the same thing, Tommy.
Yeah, supposed to be telling some kind of joke or something here.
We didn't listen very well.
Yeah, so I think it's going to be cool how this gets answered, because if you're a commercial producer, that value may be considerably less than if you're a seed stock producer. And again, I worked with some different breed associations, and that number even changes within a seed stock organization. So I'm curious to see what the answer is going to look like.
All right, we just have a couple more votes coming in. And share the results here.
Well, it looks like it was a pretty average cost. So 23% said $400 and 55% at $550, which I would have kind of thought had been kind of that average. Some of you must be seed stock guys. You got out on the edge of $850 per cow. And again, when we talk about saving, and I've got a slide here in just a minute, we're going to talk about this, that if you're at that $550 level and 75% of that is in feed cost, the return on investment by feed efficiency testing these cattle, whether that's a cow or a bull, I think are significant when we look at it. So thank you guys for participating in that. We always get the question on the cow side, should I measure or if I test my heifers? Should I test my cows? And there's quite a bit of research out there anymore that actually is helping us answer this question. But I'm going to tell you right now that we're limited in this area. I would love to see considerably more research in this area in terms of testing these, whether we're testing these as heifers or we're testing those as cows, but is that reality what they're actually doing out on the forage? So now I'll touch on that just a bit here in just a minute. But Archer and et al. In 2002, some Australian researchers actually measured some cattle as what they called weaned heifers, and then they again retested those cattle as after they had their second calf, basically as a 4-year-old, almost approaching a 5-year-old. And what they found is that early testing of those weaned heifers were a really good indicator of total lifetime savings on these cattle. Again, lifetime feed efficiency savings. So if we can test them early on when they're young, and then that really transpires into an efficient cow and tremendous savings over those years. So next slide, please. Now this transitions to a little bit different. If we look at these in terms of a cow versus a heifer, when is the opportune time to actually measure feed efficiency in these cattle? And I always told my seed stock producers, I prefer testing them at an earlier age because they're smaller, they're eating less total pounds of feed, so your feed cost is going to be less. And basically what this data is showing here tells us that it does a really nice job of measuring as cows, as heifers at a younger point in time. So if we look at this, and this is work by Dr. Monty Curley again, and if you look at this, you say, well, wait a minute, we tested these heifers and the efficient heifers didn't necessarily turn out to be the efficient cows. But you got to remember in this particular research project, these cows were actually fed a high concentrate ration, not a forage-based ration. So it tells us, again, this basically tells us we need to be measuring these cattle as young cattle and on more of a high concentrate diet, and that then in turn predicts how they're going to perform as cows. Next slide, please. This is another one of the research projects by Dr. Curley. I think this one tells the opposite side of the story. Again, you look at this and it just drives home the message that if we're testing these cattle as younger cattle, as heifers and not as cows, that we can really do a good job of differentiating the intake of these cattle. I think if you look at the range here, 9.3 pounds, 9.3 units of RFI, sorry about my office phone ringing, 9.3 units of RFI efficiency here, difference in these cattle. But when you look at total intake on them, 12.4 versus 15.6 kilograms of intake in these cattle. That's a significant improvement there in dry matter intake. And I know Dr. Curley says the biggest thing from this research project is the savings that you're going to have in total hay cost. And we know that hay is a tremendous expense. When you answered that question a while ago, if you're at $850, you probably got a pretty good hay cost involved in there. But a 20.5% less forage intake on those low versus high RFI cows is really important and significant. Now, do we know enough of that when we put them in really drought, short grass situations? That's where I think we need more research to actually validate that when we measure them as heifers, that we can actually put them in a droughty condition and they are more efficient with limited intake. Next slide, please. This one is kind of a combination slide. Boss Rob basically said 55 to 75% of your total cost is going to be in feed cost. And again, it depends on your operation where you might land there, if you're on the low side or you're on the high side. But I promise you it's going to be better than 50% you're going to be putting in feed cost and maintaining these cows. And then we look at maintenance, whether they're lactating, whether they're carrying a calf, those kind of things. Dr. Cliff Lamb in 2009 made the statement that just in Florida alone, with about 2 million cows in inventory, a 10% savings in feed efficiency is $36 million. Again, that's significant to an industry. Now that if we go into the question is, when we measure these in a what I call a high concentrate diet, and how does that look into a forage-based diet? Meyer and his co-workers in 2008 divided them into the top third and the bottom third. RFI efficient cattle found that those more efficient cattle consume 20% less forage than those least efficient cattle. So again, significant savings. Next slide, please. This is another project that Dr. Curley and his group at the University of Missouri actually worked on. I think the thing that this is on a set of Sim Angus cows is what this was here. And I think if you look and again, this is a low RFI as heifers versus what they did as a cow. Again, it slightly tweaks itself just a little bit, but the thing to look at in this research project, the dry matter intake was relatively the same across, but look what it actually did in milk production. If you look at the production of those low RFI cows in terms of milk production that's going to go into that calf, that again is significant when we look at total production from those cows, even though again, we see some conflicting information here in what we see in the heifer versus that cow. But with these kinds of milk production is going to yield more pounds of wean weight. Next slide, please. Which is, again, really cool. This kind of drives the message home when we talk about how these cattle are going to perform in the feedlot. And I think this is a really neat project that Dr. Curry and his group did. In this case here, if you look on the left-hand column, that is a negative RFI bull mated to positive RFI cows. And you're producing an F1 and looking at the performance of those cattle. The middle column is looking at a positive RFI bull mated to a set of negative RFI cows. And again, look at the values. They're very similar to the column on the left. And that's, again, those are true F1s that it looks like to me tells you that you need at least have one component, either the cow side of it or the sire side of it that needs to be RFI negative. And you see some really tremendous returns. If you look at that, the biggest thing, the takeaway message to me right here is that feed conversion ratio. Those F1 cattle are just more efficient cattle. They're going to consume less, be more efficient at it. And I think Dr. Curley always talks about this slide where he looks at the yield grade improvements, slightly improved on those F1 heterosis where you use the negative RFI parent. I'd love to have seen this study carried out a little further where we had a negative sire and negative dam group, because I think we'll even see more implication of savings in that feed conversion there. So but compliments to Dr. Curtin and his group, and again, they've done a lot of research in proving that we can lower the feed requirements in these cattle, and this project is 28%, so significant. So next slide, please. As you summarize, that Mark's going to do that. I'm not going to do that. That's Mark.
So, just run a real quick summary before we get into questions. So the first topic we looked at was the custom testing with the 29.7% internal rate of return, which is significant. Just testing your own bulls and developing your progeny with a -5 RFI EPD sire can shift you up to a $5,580 change if you're looking at a +5 RFI bull. And in Tommy's example on the progeny that were a -16 RFI compared to a set of calves that are +19 RFI. And I think I probably summarized this wrong, Tommy, because this is on the bulls, but you're saying it was the progeny. But it does make a major shift in 27% more efficiency and $80 per head. And then on the cow herd efficiency savings, I think the big takeaway is that the most efficient third of your cow herd can consume 20% less forage than your bottom third. And, depending on how you use your system, I want to throw a quick plug in here, Danielle, that if you want a different look at any kind of a system or putting in a system that really meets your needs, sure, visit with us and just email us at info@growsafe.com. That, Danielle, will go into questions.
Certainly. Thank you, Dr. Perkins. Thank you, Mark. We have a few questions already rolling in here. Just like they said, please submit your questions. There's an icon probably at the bottom of your screen. Sometimes it can float up to the top, but there's a Q&A icon. Please submit them there. We'll get to as many as we can right now. If we're not able to get to your question, we'll be certain to give you an answer after the call. Just submit it with your name so that we can use your email to give you a response. So with that, we're going to get started. Mark, we're going to start with you. What is the best way to market efficient bulls?
Oh, that's a great question. So I really think the best way is if you test within the GrowSafe network and utilize the efficiency EPDs. I really think that that's the best data out there you can market around. And it's pretty robust data. If you logged on 2 weeks ago and experienced and learned about the power of the network and the volume and the quality clients that we have that are putting the data in. I think those efficiency EPDs driven by that are probably your best tool to market around efficiency. But there's sure some other tools out there used by breed associations that are very, very good as well. And I think the key is too that when you market is you always want to market efficiency along with the other traits that are important to your clients. Obviously, we never want to single trait select and never want to get to the point where we actually over market efficiency if that's possible. But I think that you always just have to balance it out with your other marketing efforts as well. I do think that much like, you know, if you go back in time to when people started getting ultrasound data and carcass traits and marketing around, and that was really new at the time, but I don't think you can imagine right now what it'd be like to market bulls without that kind of data. And I really think when you look at efficiency data in bull sale marketing, that we're going to have the same scenario within a few short years, that if you really want to be an effective marketer of your bulls, that efficiency data is just going to be almost a requirement to be on the top end of bull marketing.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Perkins, we're going to switch over to you now. You mentioned more efficient cows eating less forage. Were these cows tested on pasture?
Great question. And if we look at, and I've got two different data sets going on here, but one of the original studies that Dr. Curley did, that was actually a high concentrate diet. And we did not get forage intake on those cattle. Again, that's very costly and time consuming, labor intensive. It's very challenging to do. But they followed that up with a research project in which they were actually going and doing grass clippings and actually measuring the amount of intake from the forage those cattle were taking off of those pastures. Not a perfect scenario, but much better than taking grass clippings and just feeding them through a GrowSafe system. I look forward to the days when we actually are able to take a 100% forage diet through a GrowSafe system and measure what those cows are doing, because I really think that all the data we are looking at tends to tell us that yes, they are going to be consuming less forage, even though we test them as heifers on a higher concentrate diet or a little less roughage than you might find out in a pasture condition. So more data to come on that, more research needed there, but I think all the other data that is there really alludes to we can positively impact forage intake and reduce it by testing for RFI on these heifers.
Great, thank you, Dr. Perkins. With generational selection, how efficient can cattle become? Do you want to take that, Mark?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really fun question. And, you know, I don't think we really know. I mean, the sky's kind of the limit. I mean, at some point, you know, you probably won't get down to equal fish on a 1-to-1, but when you really look at it, well, actually we did. We looked at 50,000 records on feed to gain, and we found within those cattle that 13% converted under 5-to-1 and 2% were actually under 3-to-1. So there's cattle out there when we select for it that can be incredibly efficient. And we do have some clients that have had some cattle that have definitely been under 4-to-1 and in that 3-to-1 range. And that's phenomenal. You start looking at if our industry shifted towards a more efficient animal that gained the same, which is possible because we already see they exist out there in the U.S. herd. If you put the math to that, it's I believe it's 1.3 billion in feed savings to the U.S. feed yard industry alone. So, you know, I don't know with stacking generations and really focused selection how good we can get, but we've proven that you can get into that 3-to-1 conversion range in the feed yard, which is significant.
Thank you, Mark. Dr. Perkins, ideally, how much selection pressure do you recommend putting on the RFI?
Well, that's a really good question. Mark, can you go back to my third slide, I think it is? And my animal breeding students would tell you that I push this one all the time. Go back to the Delta G, that right there. Thank you.
Sorry. There we go.
Forward woman, there you go. So when we never want to single trait select, even though RFI is an awesome trait and it really will give you a return on investment, we can't single trait select, and we know that. So if we take this particular formula right here, and we're going to put pressure on RFI, but let's just assume that I'm selecting for 3 other traits at the same time. We can use the formula 1 over the square root of n being the number of traits that you're actually selecting for. So we'll say that we were selecting for 3 other traits plus RFI. In this case, we've added RFI to it. That's going to be 1 over the square root of 4, or 1/2. And what that means is that we're really only accounting for 50% of that negative 0.36 units of RFI improvement. So instead of getting 0.36 improvement, we're only getting 0.18 because we're testing for additional traits. So the more traits you select for, the less that you're going to move any one of those traits. I will tell you that RFI should be in everybody's toolbox when we're selecting for whether that's 4 traits, that's 10 traits, whatever it is. RFI needs to be one of those that's in that selection criteria, because it's so important. Again, 75% of your cost goes into feed, and if you can make them 20% more efficient year after year, those numbers are going to be very impactful.
Thank you. And Mark, I have one more question. Really, it's a point of clarification I hope you can quickly address. We had one person that said 5 turns, including warm-up, means at least 400 days in a year. Can you address that real quickly with the use of GSB?
Yeah, so if you can, if you test with GSB, we need to have 49 days of trial data plus a 10 to 14 day warm-up period. So if I don't have my calculator out, but I think that they're probably counting a 70-day RFI trial to get to that number of days. But with GSB, we can adequately measure gain over 49 days as compared to 70 days without GSB, just using shoot weights.
Great, thank you, Mark. And that's with our GSB in-pen weighing technology, correct?
Exactly, yes.
Great, thank you.
Well, I'll answer that question from South Africa real quick if you want me to, about what is happening to fertility and low RFI count.
Oh, yeah, can you get to that one? That'd be wonderful.
Answer that while we've got some audience in here. Some of the early research that was out there, and Dr. Lamb, I know, did some of this, and there was some of that work being done in Australia. And what they were finding was that they were seeing a slight increase or a shortening of the days to estrus in some of these low RFI females that they were testing, which is positive. Also, they found that the CL, or corpus luteum, was actually more impactful earlier on in those low RFI cows. So I know the question is alluding to, do we make these cattle too lean? And as again, I ultrasound a lot of cattle. There's a research project out of Australia also looking at ultrasound and its prediction of basically fat levels of these cattle. Ultrasound does a really good job on these RFI tested cattle. And then I think I gave a talk, I don't know, it's probably 30 days ago, when I talked about we can select for easy fleshing cattle within all facets of RFI. So we can take a group of negative RFI females, and I promise you find easy fleshing females. And that might be a little bit different when we look at Bos, because there's probably some Bos indicus breeders on there. South Africa, for example, may be curious about, you know, these fat levels in these Brahman influenced cattle. We know they put the P8 fat on, or the runt fat, at a different level than the European cattle do. And again, RFI is not impacting that. We can still have efficient, what I call easy fleshing females that are negative RFI. They'll go out and be really nice cows for you.
Great, well, thank you. I appreciate everyone's time today. We're going to get to any additional questions after the webinar. We'll get you responses. Also, if you think of any additional questions after you leave the webinar, or anyone who watches the webinar on demand, please submit those to info@growsafe.com. And please join us next Tuesday for our final webinar in this specific series. We're going to hear from Stephanie Nelson, and she's going to be discussing the practical tips on running a feed efficiency trial. So please feel free, join us live, or you can catch the on-demand view that we'll be sending out later that day. Thank you again to Dr. Tommy Perkins and to Mark Nelson.